I'm about to wrap it up here, but just as kind of a follow-up, I know if I'm correct, about 50% of our third graders are finally reading on what I'd call average or better. I'm not sure what the numbers are, but somewhere in that range that was in the report a couple of years ago. And I guess my thought is this. If there's a reason that some kids, whether it's cultural, social, whatever, are struggling, those are the ones, it seems to me, that we really need to work on. Those who are doing fine may not need that much in terms of resources and so forth. So what is our plan to deal with those that are having that trouble? I know you've mentioned that we're increasing it, and like you say, some years we have really horrible preparedness for kindergarten, other years we don't. But what's our modus operandi there?
Mr. Shanley, can I ask a question? So we've got a focus schools presentation that's following this, which I think talks about the targeted, like how we're helping the students.
It will.
So
Yeah.
So our next presentation is about our focus schools process, which I think we'll talk a little bit about how we deal with the students. So if you want to ask questions that are more specific to the quality of the teacher piece now, and then maybe those questions could fold into the student piece in the next presentation that follows this one.
Okay, yeah.
Suggestion.
And I guess really that's pretty much all I had written here as far as questions go, but I was curious that it sounds like to me that we're doing the things that I think are good. I for whatever reason, I'm a big fan of a project place, whatever you call it.
Yes, I will get
easy
that
for
question.
you to say, So I think that's important. I think too the analysis and the way you're going through the classroom time frame and all that is important to have teachers that are pretty well focused on what they're doing. I guess if we find areas that need to be tweaked, then obviously we should be tweaking those. But we can take other questions about individual schools and so forth in the next session. That's all I've got.
Great, thank you. Ms. Goodwin Caldwell.
You mentioned that we have another presentation on focus. I don't know whether what I need to ask is from this or not. Will you be reporting on the TE21 in that? Because I know that the questions that the information we got in the email didn't really give any data or anything. Will you be reporting on like the programs that we have that we are funding?
I mean, if you're talking about T21 results, we certainly can send those to the board. We only have one benchmark so far of data this year. I mean, we can send the benchmark results to the board.
Okay, we've had T21 for how many years now?
These are our third year for all schools.
Okay, I didn't know whether this is where I need to ask that or not, because I have some questions on that. But so you mentioned differentiation. Is that taught on a district level from the academics, or are the schools responsible for teaching differentiation of instruction?
It would be both. We do a lot of differentiation work strategies with our instructional coach principals, so they're getting that information to work with teachers, and then our workshops that we do for teachers also are going to have differentiation strategies in them.
Okay.
So it's both.
That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Dr. Ball O'Connor.
What are the numbers like?
No, push it down.
Steady red.
Now you got it.
Steady red, good. Thank you, Jeff, for this. When you gave the time on the high school example for English,
Yes.
that's a lot longer session than we normally have. Is that correct?
Are you talking about this one here? Yeah, so this one here would be, this would be a traditional schedule for elementary, but I think it was 60 minutes the sheet did on this, but these will be converting to percents as well.
Okay, I was thinking by looking at it that this might have meant a higher level classroom, since you did it as if it's just an English block. So I was thinking when you mentioned, you answered another question a moment ago about how it's hard to cover in 50 minutes.
Yes.
So when I just look at this and think about best practices, it makes me wonder if 50 minutes is enough time for an effective English classroom lesson.
Yeah, so I think it depends. I mean, and English teachers, you know, probably English teachers will have very strong opinions about 50-minute periods or 45-minute periods versus 90-minute periods. What I would say is that they're following that structure. It's just that a traditional teacher might have to do in 2 days what a block teacher is going to do in 1 day. And there's pros and cons to that. I mean, the teachers on the 7-period day would say that kids need shorter amounts of bursts of information versus the longer bursts in the block. The block folks would say, of course, that we have more time to do hands-on, project-based type learning because it is a longer period. So, I mean, there's pros and cons to both.
Right, and I'm not really asking you to address a preference between those two schedules, but just to say, if this was the ideal,
Yes.
then what, would we have flexibility in the upper grades to say, I assume the principal with input from teachers could say, look, we're not really getting enough time to cycle through it in the way that best practices suggest, so maybe we want to vary our schedule for this. But I hear you saying this was based on an elementary, and I wasn't.
This is actually traditional. The English one is a traditional high school or middle school.
All right, well, that's what I thought when you said traditional schedule, but that's way more than we have on our schedule.
If you're looking at the 3, the 12, the 35, and the 5 instead of the ranges, 35, 45, what is that, 60? If you look at the first numbers, it would be a 60-minute period. So in middle school, but to your point, that's why we're moving English. We used to have the minutes out there. We're moving them all percentages because some middle schools might have 60-minute classes, to your point, and then some might have 45. So we're moving this back to percentages so teachers can adjust it.
Okay, so then I'm going to ask you to answer it a different way.
Okay.
I can imagine that the percentage could feel rushed if you had a really short time. You're coming in, you're moving from class to class, you're settling in, so I just want us to allow for the best instructional times that we can at our high schools, and I think we have by policy given that flexibility. But when you all come forward and say, in order to do this whole cycle of information really effectively with plenty of time to practice and engage, these short clips might not be enough. So I just wanted to say that occurred to me when you
Yeah, that's a great point.
About the differentiated instruction for just a moment, I was one of those board members who supported the fact that we needed to move toward differentiated instruction for the reasons you gave about the fact that we stuck people into a level of performance and they never moved out of it. But I wonder if we haven't learned enough by now of how to make sure that we avoid letting that happen to students by all these additional instructional strategies that we use, that we might sometime consider, does it really make sense to have this range in a classroom if we know that the strategies could reach and regroup with differentiated instruction, even with a narrower band of student knowledge in a given classroom. So it's not to say, should we move away from it, but it's to say, are the reasons we needed it so desperately present now? Or could we say, look, we've learned that we really cannot effectively teach 28 students in a classroom who are all over the scale as well as we could if we had 3 bands of instruction and those were divided by class, knowing that they would be regrouped throughout the year and could move to wherever they belonged the next year. So that's...
I will tell you, principals kind of are doing that now, especially at the elementary level, when they're looking at their kids prior to scheduling. Certainly, I know Narissa did. They were very intentional about what kids they put in what classroom. So it wasn't as much way in the past where it was just like third grade kids come in, throw it in the scheduler, and let the classes fall out. They are very much more intentional now, not necessarily from low, medium, high groups necessarily, but we're very intentional now about number of ESOL kids we put in a class, number of special education students we may put in a classroom. We're very intentional with that. I would say we still struggle a little bit. We struggle a little bit still with the kids getting locked into groups sometimes. One of my things my staff would say they constantly reiterate with teachers is even with the guided reading groups, is that reassessment and moving kids out of those groups. They still get stuck sometimes in those groups. And the whole point is you want to sometimes move a kid out of that group into a higher group to push them a little bit because they have the ability to do that so they don't get comfortable in the level. So I would say I think natural inclination sometimes is to fall back to that model because it's easier sometimes to do that. But I will say our principals are being much more intentional the last really 3, 4, 5 years about how we schedule kids in the classroom so that there's not such a wide range of abilities, if you will.
To know, and I would imagine they try to work with teacher preparation
Yes.
in terms of matching where the greatest need is
Yes.
with the skills that their team
Yes,
presented with.
I can tell you there are principals who will say, a lot of my ESOL kids go to Dr. Mitchell-Hofer because, gosh, she gets 80% of her kids passing the exiting ESOL or whatever it happens to be. So the principals know the strengths of the teachers, or if they work well. I was one of those teachers that worked very well with special ed students. I always had inclusion kids in my class, and they always performed very well for whatever reason. So, my principal typically, that's my team got the special ed students typically because we perform very well for special ed kids. Principals, I think, play to those strengths of the teachers that they have.
Thank you.
Mr. Lewis.
Thanks for this, and thanks for requesting it. I just had one question. When you showed the wheel with Hattie and the zone of desired effects, so
That one here.
So, one of the things that in the advocacy committee we've looked at a lot is trying to advocate for the reduction of testing. And as we talk to the General Assembly, one thing I hear back from legislators is, yeah, but you guys also do a lot of testing here that's locally mandated, that's in addition to that. And one of the ones that comes up often is Mastery Connect, which I know we've had presentations on how it improves student achievement. So as you look at this wheel, like in your mind, where does Mastery Connect fit in this? Is it feedback? Is it teaching and test taking? Is it practice testing? I mean, where is its effectiveness at measuring teacher performance, I guess?
So I would say the majority of the Mastery Connect as a whole is going to land in the practice testing the most because that's really what it is. It's not a graded test, particularly in elementary and middle school. It's not a graded test for kids to get a grade on. It's really meant to inform teacher instruction. How well did I do? What our principals would say, and our teachers who are using it with a lot of results would say that in the past I didn't know what my kids were how we're performing. I mean, you can give a formative assessment as a teacher, but that teacher created test is only as good as it matches the standards, which, as we know, a lot of times is not. And so what it has helped teachers do is actually realize the level and depth that the questions are being given to kids on the test. Because I think, as I told you all, the first year, the feedback we got was this is too hard. These tests are way too hard for kids. But it was exactly the same types of questions that were being asked on the SC Ready, SC Path, which is why we would say we've had across the board tremendous test score growth because now our teachers are understanding, oh, this is the level of depth I need to teach. So most of that would fall on practice and testing. I wouldn't fall all the way over to feedback because teachers aren't necessarily using that test to give feedback to kids as much as they are to say, okay, Mr. Lewis completely missed standard 4.3.6. So him and Mr. Shamley and Mr. Sailors, they didn't get that standard. So I'm going to pull them whenever I pull them, and I'm actually going to reteach that standard to them.
So is Mastery Connect though? Is it used to measure teacher effectiveness? Is it a tool that a principal can use to coach a teacher in where they are doing well and not?
Yes. Now, we use it heavily, particularly in the focus schools, which that's in the presentation next. But I'll talk a little bit more about how we use that data to really coach teachers to more effective teaching.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay. I have 2 more speakers and time is about to expire, so I'm going to extend for 10 minutes. But I do want to reiterate that there's a lot of overlap between this presentation and the next presentation. So if some of you want to kind of hold any of your questions, because we have another 45 minutes in that, after that presentation. So, Mr. Sutton, you're up for questions.
Jeff, my question concerns the content, not the way it's taught her. And the only thing I know is I'm taking a high school course that I want you to explain to me the content of the course. We have standards, we have a textbook, we have Chrome, we have laptops, we have Prometheus boards. If I'm going to teach a U.S. history course, where do I get the content of that from? Does it come mostly from standards?
Yes, sir.
Or from a textbook?
No, it'll come mostly from the standards. The standards tell you what content, what the kids have to know and do.
Do we usually complete all the standards in a course? It used to be when you were taught years ago that sometimes you got up to far as World War II.
Yes, sir.
But in looking at the content, every time I ask my grandkids a question, they whip out Google. So you don't need to recall. All you need to do is know how to use Google.
It's true in a lot of cases, yes.
If I'm taking the standards and I'm taking a high school subject, if I had a question on math, I learned math one way, they learn math a different way today. If they do it my way and do it their way, we get the same answer. Is that acceptable in school? Or no, it must be by the way they're doing it?
No, so we would say in math, most math teachers would say that in some cases, there's multiple ways to solve a problem. It's always going to get you the right answer. Now, if one of those ways is not going to get you the right answer, 100% of the time, then that would be one way they may discourage kids from using. But yeah, many times I've been in many classrooms where teachers taught 3 different ways and say you can use any of these ways you want to teach or to solve the math problem.
Is there an acceptable one, or does that teachers have discretion in that regard? As to, if I'm a math teacher, then I have got the way that I want to present it is my own way, but then how I want them to solve it is by one specific way, or is it going to be by the way that gets the right answer?
In most cases, it'll be the way they will get the right answer, because a teacher might teach it one way, the textbook may do it a different way. A lot of our kids use Khan Academy when they go home because they forgot how the teacher taught the content, so they may go learn it a different way at Khan Academy. What I would say is most importantly is that the teacher is going to, obviously they're going to just write the answer down, not see any of the work. The teacher may suspect that maybe the kids didn't do the work, but usually if the work is listed out, that the teacher can see how they solved the problem, then the answer would be, if it's correct, they're going to get credit for it. Now, the teacher may have a conversation with its kid later to say, this strategy is fine, you got the right answer this time, but just so you know, it only works 70% of the time or 50% of the time or not. If that way of solving is not going to work every time, certainly that's a conversation a teacher might have with that kid or students.
Yeah, I was trying to understand what the correct content was. For some things, that these are just simply the facts.
So the content will all be driven from the standards. If you look at the new social studies standards, we move completely away from what we just said before. What year did Christopher Columbus, sail for America? What year? We've moved away from that, and a lot of it because of technology we have today, because people realize facts and stuff we can find out by other ways. What we need kids to be able to do is reason. So when it comes to the Constitution, we need kids to be able to know what the Constitution says and analyze that at a certain depth to actually understand what it's saying versus just memorizing it. So we're moving into social studies. If you look at the new standards, we've moved much further into analyzing, and they aren't even going to tell us anymore what people to teach. As far as it used to be, you got to teach these people, you got to teach these dates, you got to teach these events. It's going to be a lot more of teaching more, why did the, Revolutionary War happen? Why did the Civil War happen versus what dates and all that? It's still important to know context of all that, but as far as some of that memorization, a lot of that we're moved away from.
When they asked a number of college graduates how was World War II started, 4 of them said it started because the United States attacked Japan and dropped 2 atomic bombs on it. And I was thinking, how can 4 college graduates know that little about the history of our country?
Well, what I would say again from the old standards focused so heavily on recall, more about the dates, the major battles, versus here's why we got into this conflict, whatever it happens to be. Here's why we got into the conflict, and spending so much time on memorization that we neglected some of the reasons. And that's how the standards were written. I mean, it's not anything school districts did. We were simply following the standards the states put out for us. But now we've swung more in the opposite direction, where there's going to be a lot more analysis and why do we get into the conflict and how do we get out of it, and so that you aren't repeating history, so to speak.
But aren't there basic facts? And you must know the basic facts as the beginning or as the start.
Yes, so that's going to be that surface level knowledge. They're going to have surface level knowledge, absolutely.
My last question, how do we evaluate student progress in a school? How do we compare our schools? I know one way, and a lot of people do it by the test scores. Are there other ways that we evaluate our schools by?
Well, the test scores are going to, that's probably more in the focus school presentation next.
Okay, thank you. I'll wait for that then.
Okay.
And ask you that question
You
at
just
that
have to do that
time.
if I don't cover it
Thank you,
next.
ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Mr. So. Ms. Morrison-Fair, you want to prep your questions or kind of ask those questions, and then we'll do the presentation?
Okay. Just something for you to think about, Jeff. How many instructional coaches do we have per school?
So the district base, the one we provide district-wide, is 1 instructional coach per school. However, there are, in our Title I schools, we have additional coaches in those schools. And we also, don't forget, in elementary school, we have at least in every school, we have a 0.5 literacy coach, at least in every school. Some of those may be 1.5, depending on the ratios. But instructional coach base district is 1 per school.
1 per school. And I wanted to know more about it. Maybe you will get into the second presentation. The combination between environment and engagement of the students. And I looked at the presentation. Most classrooms are not, unfortunately, everybody's sitting down and doing what they're supposed to do. So I'm curious as to know, how do you get teachers on board with their instructional delivery when they have diverse classes, personalities, so forth and so on? Are those instructional coaches going into the classrooms, helping teachers demonstrate good instruction, or how does that happen?
Yeah, so it is instructional coaches that help do that. It's also the academic specialists that we have that we'll talk about in the next presentation. A lot of them are also going in and modeling and coaching teachers on how to make classrooms more engaging.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Morrison-Fair. Okay, we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is, again, very similar. Agenda item 2.03, Focus Schools Process. Dr. Royster, do you want to tee this up?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. And as you had already mentioned, and Mr. McCoy as well, this presentation is complementary to and flows from and with the presentation that you just saw. As you will recall, we adopted a focus school process several years ago, starting out with teaming academic specialists to help provide support and instructional leadership, specifically to Title I schools. We then expanded that to all schools that are having some struggles with student achievement, specifically targeting those schools that are identified through the state process, but not limited to Title I or schools targeted through the state process, but also schools where principals have asked for and indicated a need for some assistance in moving their instructional achievement forward. Those may well be some schools where they simply are not achieving at the level of schools similar to that school. It may have nothing to do with an assignment of some particular status based on the report card. So we wanted to share this information with you too. I think Mr. McCoy has it organized in such a way that we begin by looking at those schools that are identified, along with a little bit of a reminder, because a lot of that terminology is very confusing, and the state has over the years changed terminology that relates to schools that are being identified as having barriers or struggles to succeed. So we want to review a little bit about the categories of schools, how those can be attained, the point system which identifies the various categories. And I think one of the most important points coming out of that is that it is an ever-changing point system that is, the state is in essence moving the bar. If you think about it like a high jump, they're in essence moving the bar every year without regard to the performance of the athletes, and in this case, the schools involved in the process. So you'll see some areas of concern, I think, that you've heard us mention before about the entire grading process for schools, but more importantly, accepting that there are great limitations within those systems and flaws within it. We have to move schools forward within the system that we have, and you'll hear the discussion about the strategies, the leadership, both from the assistant superintendents that lead and supervise the schools, and from the leadership within the academics division to support that and provide the kind of tools, the kinds of training, the kinds of leadership that we need to provide for our students, our teachers, our schools, and our principals. Mr. McCoy?
Thank you, Dr. Brewster. So we will, after this presentation or next week, we will send you an updated copy of the improvement designations. Dr. McDavid and Dr. McCreary, as they were looking at that last week, found some errors that we are now contacting the State Department about. So we are waiting on the State Department's response for that. This is going to change slightly with the number of schools and all that, just basically based on some errors that they believe they found. So, and I believe they found. And so we will update this, this sheet here that I'm using. We'll update this. It's got the screenshot in the presentation. Ms. Fitzer will send this to you once it's updated from the State Department. We know it's correct. Okay, so Dr. Royster already mentioned a little bit. You recall, this is the same slide we used last year. Just to outline, this is the elementary middle school one, that the schools are assigned 100 points, obviously, for the report card index. The things in the middle there are the things that are awarded points. So for learning environments, 10 points. Prep for success is 10 points. You can see the big one, obviously, is academic progress. And the academic ELA and math on there. So you can see how much of that makes up the test scores that we're going to talk about today. So obviously, once that's all done, points are accumulated. They are then given a number, and that number corresponds to a state rating from unsatisfactory all the way to exceeds. And we're talking about the focus school process with this, but we wanted you to have the context of all of our schools and how we support the schools with the state designations. So this is the one that we will send you, that you will see. These are the 4 categories of designations that are awarded to districts, given, I should say, districts, based on the performance of their students and the performance of the report card data. So I'm going to start on the left there. The left one is the comprehensive student and comprehensive support and improvement, and that is what we will refer to as CSI. CSI is the lowest category. That's the one that has the most state support. There's a lot of sanctions that come down on if you are a CSI school. So that's definitely the one. We don't want to be in necessarily any of the categories, but that's the one that we pay close attention to try to make sure we don't, any of our schools don't fall into. That's the one that you're going to get a transformational coach from the state. There's a lot of money that comes with it as well, but there's a lot of oversight that comes with that. That's where the advanced ed team comes in. They evaluate the leadership of the school, and they make a recommendation to the superintendent as far as whether or not the leadership of that school is capable of leading that school out of CSI status. So again, kind of punitive, very punitive as far as the CSI status goes. We only have one school that was identified back in 2018. These are identified every 3 years, the CSI schools. The priority schools, those are schools that have, and I should say, you probably can't read that, but the CSI schools are schools with an overall weighted point index at or below the 5th percentile. So that's the lowest 5% of the state. It does say Title I in there. However, it's not just Title I schools that can fall into that status. We'll talk about later, other schools can fall into that status. For priority schools, that's any school with a weighted point index at or below 10th percentile. So these are your 10th percentile schools. And so those are the schools that there's money with those as well that's going to come. And those are going to be identified, again, every 3 years. So every 3 years, those are identified. The only exception to that was this past time, we had a shortened cycle because of when it was approved. So we had a 2-year cycle, and the next one will be a 3-year cycle. So technically those schools, hopefully they won't stay in that status, but if they were, they'd be in that status 5 years, because the first cycle was only 2 years. And then the additional targeted support and improvement, that is our ATSI schools. Those are the ones we talked about last time we did this update with you all, that has to do with subgroup performance. So if you have a subgroup in your school, we'll take Eastside, for example, because really this designation, the whole time we heard about this in accountability, they kept telling us you could have a school with an excellent school rating and they could be in ATSI. In other words, let's just take Eastside, for example. Eastside could, for example, be an excellent school on the state report card. However, if their special education students are not performing above the students who are in the CSI group, then they would be listed as an ATSI school because they have a population of students, a subgroup population of students that are underperforming at the same rate as the schools in the CSI status. Okay? So it's possible after the cycles of 2 cycles. So if a school is listed in ATSI for 2 cycles, and normally again that would be 6 years. This year we're in a 5-year, but if they were in there for 6 years, they would then actually move to CSI status, the lowest designation in the state. So the whole point of that was, yes, you could have a very high-performing school be in a CSI status because of their subgroup population performance. Subgroups are ethnic, it could be poverty, it could be special ed, it could be any of the subgroups that we have currently in the district. I will tell you, as you will see in the future though, the ones for us and the one across the state that is most identified as the subgroup is underperforming is our students with disabilities, and that's true across the state as well. And then the last one is the TSI. That's identified yearly. That's really a check. There's no money that comes with that. There's no penalties that come with that. It's just a real check for principals to say, hey, you got a subgroup population that's not performing as well as they should be in there. So technically you could stay on this list forever. As long as you don't slip into that 5% below subgroup population, you could technically stay on a TSI list forever. There's no penalty necessarily to being on that list. Obviously, we don't want folks on that list. But as you can see, we have about 640 statewide schools identified across the state. So it's a large number of schools. I mean, the whole point's improvement, continuous improvement, keep pushing people to higher levels of improvement. So you can see, I keep using this to work. You can see a little bit here. I try to summarize some things on there. The first 3 bubbles there, those first 3 are identified every 3 years in the state. And the last one, like I said, is identified yearly. You can see the dollar signs, which schools we get money for, which ones we don't. CSI is going to be the area that we get the most money for. But remember what I said before, you also get the most restrictions and oversight with CSI as well. With all of these, just so you don't think it's just a bunch of money that's sent to a school unencumbered, there is a plan that is required to be due for every school that gets money in those 3 categories. My staff's been heavily involved with this. Dr. McDavid is kind of the lead on that. She makes sure all those plans are in place. She works with the assistant superintendents on those plans and the principal. So that is a whole district effort so that we make sure that if they're going to spend this, we'll get the money. So if we're going to spend the money, it needs to be on strategies that are effective to get them out of that, whatever designation they fall into. There is no money for the last one. The points, Dr. Royster talked about the points. These are the cut scores you can see for elementary, middle, high for each of the categories. So what that really just means is for CSI, if the students performed for elementary, if they were performing at a 30, if they had gotten 30 points there, obviously the elementary cutoff was 31.04, so they would be in a CSI designation for that. Now the thing to know is if I show you this next year, all those numbers will change. Okay, so what we're careful about telling schools is that if you are 10 points away, let's say you're performing at a 41 for elementary. Even if you're performing at a 41, you have to be very careful because just like us, every other school in the district's working to get off this list, off the state's working to get off this list. So for example, I don't remember, Jason, I think it was 8 points the elementary gained this year, points maybe. It's fine. It was a larger number. So even from last year to this year, the cut score went up because those schools in that designation are performing higher now. And so we talked to our principals about that's not the cut score for 3 years. You have to be careful because those schools are performing higher. So the cut score is going to get higher and higher every year to fall in that designation. So that's just kind of awareness of principals. So they're paying attention to where they're falling and continuously improving. So you can kind of see the cut points for every one of these. Again, these are going to change. Next year when I show you these numbers will be completely different for the cut scores. These are the schools that are falling in. Again, this is the one I want. Nothing's really going to change except for the nothing on the first page will change. The second page is what's going to change. We had some schools that, again, we believe are wrong on the list, and so we are working with the state to identify those schools. But you can kind of see, again, as you would expect to see, most districts are going to trend this way as far as you want. You really don't want to be on the list at all, necessarily, and that's why we're going to work to get off those lists. But you want the least number of schools in the left-hand column. Obviously, you want none if you can get there. So you guys see our schools. We only had one school in CSI. We had 4 schools in priority. Those are the schools in CSI and priority that we would be taking into consideration for when we identify them for focus schools. Again, remember those are only identified every 3 years, not focus schools, but the state designations are only every 3 years. So again, because we have the cut scores though every year, we kind of know, Dr. McDavid works with the superintendents with the schools, they kind of know to say, ooh, this school's getting a little close to this designation. If it was an identification year, if this was an identification year, they'd be very close to this designation. So she works with them, and that might be an indicator of, okay, we need to put that school on a focus school next year as a preventive measure to hopefully keep them out of this state designation. So the state, this just shows you the designations by subgroup. There's 535 of those in here. This is just what each subgroup, a number of elementary schools were identified for the subgroup population. So for example, 41 schools were identified, 41 elementary schools were identified as their white subgroup as underperforming. Okay, so they would be on one of those lists for that. 27 elementary schools were identified because of their, that's LEP is limited English proficiency. Their ESOL kids are not, they're underperforming in a subgroup. So that just kind of shows you across the state where we fall and where they've identified. You obviously see the largest, as I talked about already, the largest identification is obviously students with disabilities. Across the state, 283 elementary schools across the state are on a list because their students with disabilities are underperforming. So moving into that, so how do we support these schools to make sure that they don't either stay on those lists or they don't fall into those lists? Or how do we do that preventatively? We've talked to you before about the focus schools. And so we do that as a shared effort with the assistant superintendent. So every year, typically March, April, we start preliminary identifications of, we think these schools can roll off because they've got some sustainability in place for what we've been working with them, and we believe these schools come on. Obviously, we're limited in how many schools we can take on. We can't take on 20, 30 schools because of our limited bandwidth of the senior leadership level that oversees that with the assistant superintendents and the academic leadership. But we look at that every March, and then we really finalize that based on the test scores when they come back in. Sometimes schools surprise us and they're higher than we expected, and so they may not end up going into a focus school status, and a school that we didn't have on our radar all of a sudden is on our radar. And so we do adjust that based on the test scores. We take the state designations into consideration. We also take other things into consideration as well. Sometimes schools ask to be focused schools. Sometimes we identify schools that maybe a principal has identified as kind of slowing test scores or scores that aren't moving. They're just stagnant. A lot of times we'll identify those schools as well. And then Title I schools, all Title I schools, to Ms. Morrison-Fair's question, all Title I schools are automatically receiving additional focus support because they all have additional instructional coaches in addition to their regular instructional coach that the district provides. All of them, almost all of them, have paid for an additional instructional coach. They have additional reading coaches, they have additional interventionists, so they have a lot of other resources they add in Title I to help support their teachers and their students. So we showed you this graphic before, kind of as far as what a focus school kind of looks like. And I know you can't read that, so we're going to go into those individually here. The big thing I want to emphasize on this, though, is sustainability. The whole point of the focus school process is that we are not there for 12 years. The idea that academics and assistant superintendent with that partnership, the idea that we are going in for really ideally no more than 3 years. Now, some may exceed that. If you have principal change, if you have some, it's a little slower getting started, it may be longer than that, but ideally it's 3 years. It's going to be unlikely a school's in there less than 3 years because it takes that long to get sustained change in place. These administrative supports are critical. So this is what the assistant superintendents are heavily involved in. They support the schools way outside the monthly meetings. They're in the schools, they're talking to principals constantly, particularly at the focus schools. But we have a meeting with the focus schools once a month that involves myself or Charlotte or Ms. Dean and the assistant superintendent who oversees that school with all the school's administration, with any coaches on our side that's supporting and the instructional coaches at the school. So it may be 8, 10 people in the room around these monthly administrative meetings. And we do basically updates. And so we are modeling for them and helping them put in place structures and processes that they can actually put in place to sustain the growth that we're seeing in those schools. The assistant superintendents really are the ones that really coach the principals in those regards. Again, academics supports them and helps them as needed in that regard. The support for teachers. So what's it look like for teachers? Certainly, as someone asked last year, initially this may feel a little punitive, and why is the district coming in to work with us? What's all these people doing here? That pretty much goes away after about 3 months. Because by the end of the school year, the teachers are grabbing our folks and asking them to come in the classroom and see what they've learned. So their demand actually increases as the school year goes on because the teachers start seeing growth, and so they're excited about that growth. So what that looks like for us is coaching cycles. All of us, not the senior level, but all of our academic specialists do coaching cycles with teachers. We model for the instructional coach. The instructional coach typically comes alongside our academic specialist at least for one coaching cycle because we want to model to make sure they know how to do a coaching cycle. A coaching cycle then is done with all teachers, not just the struggling teachers. It's done with all because all teachers have an ability to grow and learn. And actually our higher teachers, our more advanced teachers actually are the ones that want the coaching cycle because they have that growth mindset typically. It's on-site. We do a lot of on-site PD. We do a lot of professional learning community support. A lot of the focus schools we go into, the professional learning community is just not as strong as they need to be. Maybe the teachers aren't working or meeting together regularly like they should be. So we really go in and help shore up that structure of professional learning communities and learning. The admin and coaching meetings. These meetings are monthly with again, the coaches, the admins, all of those folks around the table. We do a lot of analyzing data. We just finished our last round of the T21 analyzation of data. That's how we know if we're meeting our mark. Did our kids master the standards we expected them to master? And if not, what's the plan to go back into place to make sure that we are mastering those standards? So that, again, might be observations we're doing. At the beginning of the year, it's going to be data from the state. We're going to analyze SC-ready data. But I will tell you, the last one I just sat in on, we were comparing last year's students in 3rd grade to this year's 4th grade's T21 benchmarks. And we were identifying those areas where the kids actually fell. Okay, that's a big red flag. If kids as a class have fallen from where they performed at the end of 3rd grade and now they're in 4th grade and they've fallen, that's a red flag to us. So we're going to go in and provide some extra support for that teacher. We're going to identify some resource that we can help that teacher with. How do we help you get your students to mastering proficiency a little bit at a higher level? And then progress monitoring by our admin team. So this, again, the assistant superintendents do a lot of this when they're in the classrooms, and sometimes formally, informally. A lot of times when they're in schools, they just pop in the classrooms and observe, and they're getting information every time they do that. But we do a lot of observations, and sometimes observing the coaches as well to make sure they are coaching the way they need to be coaching. And then what the assistant superintendents help put in place is that regular discussion around instruction at the weekly admin meeting. The weekly admin meeting should not just be operational, but it should be, okay, Dr. Ball-Connor, you observed fifth grade. How's fifth grade going? They meet their coaching goals this week. What did you see? So that discussion should be happening on a weekly basis at the coaching meetings. And so that's what they help put in place, that structure, that we're having instructional conversations weekly, not just quarterly when the benchmarks come out or when the state tests come out. And then lastly is instructional rounds, and I'm going to ask Ms. Lewis to kind of talk about the instructional rounds process and kind of what that looks like in a school and how that impacts the work that we do at the district level.
So our instructional rounds process is one that we're all very excited about because it provides us with an opportunity to observe and, can you hear me? Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I'll start over. Our instructional rounds process is one that we're all equally excited about because it provides us with an opportunity to observe in our classrooms. The goal of the instructional round is to look at student achievement, but specifically at the interactions between the students, the teacher's knowledge and delivery of the content. And then we're also looking for consistency in terms of student engagement, accountable talk, the planning process, and whether or not the instructional expectations are being followed consistently. The instructional rounds includes both administrators, ICs, coaches, members of the academic team. And the great thing about the instructional round process here is that we have had opportunities to participate in instructional rounds at different schools. So for example, just recently Gateway Elementary had a session of instructional rounds focused on accountable talk. So schools from throughout the district were invited to be a part of that instructional round. We looked at data specifically focused on the area of accountable talk and whether or not we felt like that was being implemented consistently throughout the school. Teachers like the instructional round process because it is not evaluative, but it is informative. And we use that information again just to make sure that the instruction that is being delivered is consistent throughout the school. So if you look at this slide, we choose a focus area, we gather a group, we observe classrooms focused on that specific area. The example I gave was accountable talk. It could be that we're looking at the mini lesson in our balanced literacy program. We come together after the instructional round to debrief the visit, and then we look at some things that we can do to provide next steps. And I think that we all have enjoyed this process just because it's not as evaluative as what we have done in the past with just doing those classroom observations. It is indeed a tool or a strategy that we use to improve instruction and then to provide teachers with the feedback that they need to move forward.
As Ms. Lewis said, one of the things too that we use this for, we use it for calibration within our team. And we encourage administrators to use that for calibration in our team. If the three of us are going, if three different administrators are going in, that feedback should be fairly consistent that we're giving at the same level. And so the instructional rounds helps calibrate that. So once we go and observe, and we always have a goal for the instructional rounds, as Narissa said. So if we're going in and observing a guided reading lesson in fourth grade classrooms, when we walk out, we might say, okay, well, here's what I saw, and Dr. Ball-Connor might say, well, here's what I saw. I would have said this, and Ms. Wells might say, I saw this. If those three things are vastly different, then we've got some work to do as an admin team. We're not all on the same page when it comes to what we're looking for. And so that also helps us at the district level do the same thing, but really at the school level, it helps the schools calibrate. We do this as for the focus school process, but almost all of our schools are doing instructional rounds on their own. We don't always get to participate because we can't participate in 100 schools. But the assistant superintendents I know sometimes participate in instructional rounds outside of even their focus schools in that. So The value of that is giving the feedback. We have some schools that ask every time when we say, look, we're looking for some instructional rounds for the district level to bring in some principals to kind of observe to help them understand how the process works. There's some schools that volunteer every single time for the instructional rounds process because they like the feedback that it gives them at the end of that session. Because we will leave the principal feedback. Here's what we saw. Here's what you worked on. Here's the PD you gave. Here's what we should have seen. Here's what we did see. And here's some things that we didn't see that you kind of told us you expected us to see. And then the principal from there can go out and actually do additional work with teachers, coaching, PD, whatever the next steps might happen to be on that. So the coaching cycles we've talked about before, but those are intense. Those are 6-week cycles. So a teacher goes through a coaching cycle, it's 6 weeks. And so you can see the cycle up there. We typically are sitting down with that teacher. We set the goal. What is the goal for the lesson? The first week we go in there and do that. A lot of times we'll let the teacher set that goal. A lot of times after that, we work to set the goal with the teacher based on what we're seeing in the classroom. Sometimes the teachers don't always set the goals necessarily around really where the biggest deficits are. And so we might help maneuver that a little bit. And then we review the lesson plan. So before, if I'm doing this as a coach, I'm looking at the lesson plan. I might script out some questions off to the side. I don't understand how this activity relates to standards. I'm not really sure. So I'm going to script out some things on my lesson plan to look at. I'm going to then pre-conference with the teacher. I might ask some of those questions. This is really not a point for me to tell a teacher what they're doing or not doing necessarily, but this is really just for me to ask questions and get clarifying questions. So tell me how you come up with this activity. And then I'm observing the lesson. So I'm using the plan to observe the lesson. So the lesson might look good on paper, but maybe the execution was weak on that. And so I'll observe the lesson, and then we post-conference, which is probably the most valuable part. So we'll sit down a lot of times and say, well, Ms. Wells, how did you think that lesson went? So do you feel like the kids accomplished the goals? Were they able to do the work? So again, a lot of questioning. It's not so much I'm saying, well, Ms. Wells, I didn't see this, and this really didn't go so great, and this didn't. We're having that discussion as a coaching conversation around that. Based on that output, then we will set the goal for the next week's cycle. So again, that's going to be a 6-week cycle that we'll do the same thing for 6 weeks and grow. Now, a teacher that might be really struggling, we may pause the coaching cycle for a minute, and we may interject a coach or an instructional coach into the coaching cycle, and they may actually model for the teacher for a week or two. So I may actually go in the classroom and actually model the lesson so the teacher can see what I'm talking about if they're struggling. So we may pause this. So sometimes technically a cycle could last longer if we're having to pause and do modeling alongside of it for a teacher. Typically that's going to be teachers who are in their first or second year of teaching who may be struggling. It doesn't always have to be. It can be veteran teachers too, but most of the time it's going to be those first, second year teachers who are really struggling. They don't have the background knowledge to really understand sometimes the strategies we're talking about. They need to see them. So then we'll go in and model them. Just like Austin did, the teacher, you didn't see her. The teacher was in the room. The teacher didn't really need modeling. That teacher didn't. But in a lot of cases, what you saw Austin doing is what this would look like in a model situation. Austin would go in, and she would actually do the lesson. The teacher and her would plan together. She would model the lesson, and the teacher would be in the back taking notes and observing. And then they would debrief the post-conference afterwards in that. And so that I talked about the inner circle. That's what the inner circle of a coaching cycle looks like. The outer circle is the critical part. When we first put the focus school process in place, that was the part that was missing prior. We've had instructional coaches and academic specialists for years. When we started looking at why is all this coaching not working? Because we're doing all this coaching, but we're not seeing the yield we want to see with coaching. And what we realized really was that the missing part was that outer ring. And so now in a focus school, any school really, what we tell our administrators is that if there is a coaching cycle happening in the building, you as an administrator, principal, assistant principal, AA, you have got to observe in that classroom at least every other week. We prefer weekly, but at least every other week. And what you're doing is you are providing feedback specific to the goal of that coaching cycle. So to Marissa's point, if you were looking at accountable talk, then I'm going to make sure the feedback I give as an administrator when I walk in that classroom is going to be around accountable talk. I might comment on some other things too, but it needs to be on the goal of the coaching cycle. What that does is solidifies for the teachers as well that, okay, my administrator is coming in to also monitor and make sure that these things are happening in the classroom. And so without that feedback, and that's good feedback then to the coach and the teacher will review, and then they will go through the coaching cycle again the following week. This again just looks, this is just again, same model, just again 3 to 6 times during the coaching cycle we expect the administrator to be in the building, be in the classroom. They certainly could be in there more. If it was a struggling teacher, they may be in there more. The principal might be helping the coach, or the assistant principal might be helping the coach along with the instructional coach. So how do we monitor the ongoing progress? How do we, I think Mr. Sudduth asked this kind of question, how do you monitor progress? In the past, the monitoring of progress was very difficult outside of reading, because reading we had our own measure, if you will. We had Font Spinel, before that we had other things. The ongoing progress monitoring is very critical because we want to make sure that what we're coaching teachers on, the strategies they're putting in place are actually impacting kids, that the kids learn. If they didn't, I need to know first 9 weeks what standards the kids did not know. It doesn't help me to know that at the end of the year because there's nothing I can do about it at that point. So I need to know that sooner than later. So one of the things that we do to monitor the progress of the focus school and the process, how do we know if a focus school is making progress? Well, one of the structures we put in place, this is a screenshot of one that you'll see. So this is an elementary school focusing feedback, and I've taken out, this is actually a live one, but I've stripped out all the information from it. But you can see, except for our coaches, you can see our coaches in there. But what happens is when we go in and coach a grade level, in this case we're doing 4th grade at a school, you can see the grade level data. We sit down and we pull all the data available. That might be T21. At the beginning of the year, it's going to be just their test scores because that's all they got. At the beginning of the year, they have their individual kids SC ready, SC pass, so that can be invaluable information for them as well. And then we're sitting down and actually building grade level goals and data. What do we expect our kids to do at the end of this, whatever, unit, lessons, coaching cycle? Then what you see on the right is the administrator's feedback. So this would have been an administrator that would have gone into the room during a coaching cycle, observed the coaching cycle, and they put their feedback in here. The reason they do that is because when the assistant superintendents are going into their meetings, this is what we are looking at. We are looking at this data. One of the reasons, again, remember the whole point of this is that we are coaching principals as well and assistant principals on sustainability. How we want to walk out of this school in a year, 2 years, 3 years. So what we might do is read the notes they gave back to the teacher, and we might work with that principal if it's too generic. If they say, great job, really like the accountable talk. That really doesn't help a teacher improve or doesn't help a teacher know what they did well. So we might work with that principal to say, let's figure out how to say that in such a way that's either going to help the teacher take it a little further, or maybe they did do a great job with it, but your kids were on task during the accountable talk. I heard them talk about whatever happens to be, giving specific details for feedback. Remember, feedback for kids is critical. Feedback for teachers is just as critical. That's specific. And then finally, the team teaching. So Austin Green, who you saw in the video, Aiken is one of the coaches at the school. A coach modeled and teachers practices strategies based on value. They're simply saying to the admin, so when the admin goes in the classroom to observe a coaching cycle, this is what they're pulling up. So they know what the coach is working on with the teacher, so they can make comments specifically to that coaching goal. So this is what it will look like simply on the actual coaching feedback log. So you can see it by grade level, math, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, so and so. It's actually by teachers. We can actually see the results-based coaching school by teacher, so we can see how teachers are doing and what other support do we need to provide those teachers. If after one coaching cycle they've not improved, what other support do we need to provide for a teacher? Our goal is retention, obviously, of teachers. There's the grade level coaching goals again, and then you can see the grade level logs. And so if the grade level is working on something, whatever they're working on, we can pull those logs open and see those as well. This is just what it looks like. We are data heavy because that's the only way we know if our kids are improving or not. And so at the beginning, we will look, and you can see the post data, the unit assessment, the baseline data. So we can see up there, you can see it on the screen. We can see up there for that baseline for the first unit, only 2 kids met the actual standard. So only 2 kids, which was 9%, were able to do that first standard after the teaching was done. So then we would look at the post-assessment data, and the post-assessment data would show us that 10 students or 48% of the kids have met that standard. So we're moving up on the standards and the success as far as meets. We would continue to work with the kids that are not. So the kids that are continuing to not do well, we would continue to work with them. And so you can kind of see this for every unit that we're doing here across the board. So and you can also see on the side there the principal and assistant principal feedback. So in this case, you can see both feedbacks. And this would be a long document. You would see multiple levels of a feedback. And then the individual coaching log. So this is just what teachers coach. This is what we would be working with the teachers and their notes. It's critical that coaches keep notes because they got to know next week when they go in where they are and how to proceed next time. And so this is just how they keep their individual logs in what they've worked on with teachers. And they do this together. Teachers and coaches do this together. So what are some of the results as we're looking at that? Now, I will say too on this back here, a lot of it, like I said, the data that we're doing in here is all kinds of data. It can be teachers' formative assessment data, their common assessment data. We do look all 3 times a year, we do look at the TE21 data. I mentioned in the last presentation, the very first benchmark for TE21, we are comparing that with last year's students SC Ready. We expect that those students are fairly equal to where they were last year. We want to look for those red flags and say, oof, they've dipped down. In this classroom, the kids have actually lost ground. And so then we're going to go in there and intensify the support for that teacher to make sure that they are working towards that proficiency. And we look, the way that that works is that T21 is basically the percent proficient that are projected for kids to be on scoring on the SC Ready. So that's the number we use when we're looking at the data. So the focus school results, you saw this at the workshop that we did for you at the beginning of the year. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but this is just kind of where we are. As you can see, the last couple of years specifically, we took you from the year that we started with the coaching cycles, as a focus school. So some schools, there's varying years as far as when we pull people on and off. So you can kind of see where we fell. For the most part, our gains at our focus schools are much higher than the gains at the, at other schools, because we're intensifying the support in those schools. I mean, they're getting sometimes 4 or 5 coaches in the school working with teachers. One instructional coach is hard sometimes to work with the whole staff, and so we're going in and really helping the model and work with them. And so you can kind of see there's some areas there. Woodmont, as we talked about in the workshop, the high school dropped across the board multiple years in math, not just Greenville County, but across the state. So we're continuing to work, obviously. You can see they make gains in English language arts as well. We also had a leadership change in there, so that's what I talked about before. Sometimes we may be in a school more than 3 years because you could have a leadership change mid-year or mid that cycle. And if you do, then you're going to carry that in school probably for a little longer. Montague is one of those examples. Montague is now off. They are no longer a focus school, but we stuck with them in 18 and 19 because Mr. Qualls was brand new. He took over a school once we had started the process, but then that principal left and Damon came in. So we stuck with them a little longer because he wanted us to actually be there a little longer as he got his feet under him for with his school. But you can see Montague's made some great gains as well. So I wanted to just briefly kind of look at the what the principals say. I sent it to you in, not the video, I sent the testimonials from principals as far as how they're using the data. And certainly the assistant superintendents can speak to that as well. We are using the T21 data we use to progress monitor is what our team uses for everything to look at curriculum. That gives us valuable information. When we see across the board a 4th grade motion standard across the district was very low, we're going to take a look at that standard and determine, okay, is there a curriculum weakness there? Are we doing something at district level that our curriculum is not strong enough to support that? Or the assistant superintendent's going to be looking at that, the data, to actually know which principals to work with, or to which schools to provide support with. We work outside the focus schools. That's not the only schools we work with. We get calls from principals all the time that says, really concerned about my 4th grade math data based on my percent proficient for TE21. Can you all come out there and work with my math teachers? Or my teachers are asking a lot of times. They'll reach out to us and ask us if we can help. And so that's really how we use that data at the district level, aside from all the ways I also put in that document I sent to you, to really inform both instruction and to inform our curriculum and to provide support. In the past, we didn't know how to support teachers necessarily without data. We knew that which teachers needed help, but we didn't always know if we were making progress. So this is just a This is a video we did as part of an award application we sent in last year. So this is going to focus on Damon and Heather Hester, Damon Qualls and Heather Hester. Keep in mind, Damon Qualls is exiting focus school. He's already out of the focus school. He's no longer a focus school. So he's going to talk a little bit about that. Ms. Hester actually is in year 2 officially of her focus school process. So both are going to talk about their experiences in different places.
Raise their hand and remind Ms. Moore, how do you find perimeter?
You have to add them all together.
Add them all up.
Greenville County Schools is focused on continuous improvement for all students, regardless of socioeconomic status, disability, language barrier, or other challenge.
So one of the stereotypes that we are wholeheartedly committed to breaking is that students at Title I schools are not capable of reaching their goals and doing well on standardized tests.
that the opposite sides are even.
Our philosophy is that all children can learn if given access to high-quality leadership, teaching, curriculum, and resources.
The training that we've received from the academics department has just been absolutely phenomenal. It has changed the way that we teach. It has changed the way that we look at how our students are learning.
Open up your Cheez-Its.
Greenville County Schools Academics Division developed a Focus Schools program to provide intensive wraparound supports for historically underperforming schools with scores moving in the wrong direction.
Yes, it hurt our feelings when we got that initial report card status, but we knew that wasn't us, and we knew that we could show the world that that is not who we are and that is not what we do each and every day. And so we buckled down and we got to work. And look what happened.
Instructional rounds and coaching cycles for teachers earn buy-in when they see their administrators undergoing professional development to become better instructional leaders. When everyone is working to get better, no one feels singled out.